Today our topic is Shankara and Meister Eckhart. It's as spiritual as an academic topic, in generally speaking. Eckhart is called Meister Eckhart, and Shankaracharya is called Acharya Shankara. So, Meister means master, and Acharya also means master. The Vedanta Society and its spiritual philosophical heritage are built upon the philosophy of non-dualism as expounded by Adi Shankaracharya, who combined in his short life various roles of a mystic, a philosopher, an academic, a system builder, a great poet. He was the greatest philosophical figure in India's long philosophical history, and is also the author of the most sublime, most beautiful, and the grandest devotional poetry in Sanskrit literature. If you look at religion in a broad perspective, it has 4 levels of evolution. From the kindergarten to, let us say, Harvard or Stanford. At the kindergarten level, rituals, external practices, ceremonials, prayers done in congregation, not as part of individual spiritual quest, but more as a kind of social discipline, uniformly performed by a large number of devotees. And then mythology to support these prayers and these external practices. And the 3rd level of evolution, philosophy or metaphysics. And at the highest level, mysticism or intimate inner experience of what theologies and philosophical systems try to explain. Because philosophies and theological systems cannot really explain experience, because experience is something that can only be experienced, cannot be explained. This is what is called mysticism, the inner experience. That's the last point of spiritual quest, evolution of spiritual life. Now, in Christian theological tradition, perhaps Eckhart is the only figure who combined in his life both mysticism and a philosophical doctrine that comes very close to non-dualistic philosophy as expounded by Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya expounded his philosophy through his commentaries on the Upanishads, Gita and Brahma Sutras, 10 Upanishads, 10 commentaries, Brahma Sutras and Gita. And Eckhart's major work is Opus Tripartium, his sermons. He was a great theologian, a great philosopher. He belonged to the Dominican order. That's why he was persecuted to the end of his life by the Franciscans. He was a theologian, philosopher, and also a mystic, all rolled into one. He lived, let's say, between 1250 to 1327, almost 500 years after Shankaracharya. Shankaracharya belonged to the early part of 8th century AD, and Eckhart lived in 13th century. The difference is that Shankaracharya was a university of spiritual education. You know what it means? Among his works, you find small, little books, primary books, primers, sometimes only about 20 pages, 30 pages, and simple poems, and also the most profound philosophical works ever written in Oriental tradition. And along with that, he is a founder of no less than 10 monastic orders. 6 of them continue to flourish to our times. And our own Ramakrishna mission tradition belongs to one of those 6 still active monastic orders, the Puri Sampradaya. Sri Ramakrishna's teacher who ordained him into sannyasa was one of the monks belonging to one of the 10 monastic orders founded by Shankaracharya. Another difference is Eckhart was the greatest mystic known to Christian tradition, was persecuted because sainthood had to be conferred upon a great saint by an ecclesiastical office which may not be represented by a person who may be himself a saint very often. So he was called by the Pope, but we don't know what really happened. He had to prove his doctrines, great interpretations of biblical literature, in mystical philosophical language, and he was accused of heresy, going against the central doctrines of the Holy Trinity, the doctrines originally expounded by Augustine, and he was persecuted by the clergy, the senior clergy belonging to the Franciscan order, though he was protected by the bishop belonging to the Dominican order, to which he belonged. But then we don't know what really happened. It is said that he disappeared in one version. Another version is that he died a natural death on his way to face the verdict by the ecclesiastical authorities. In Shankara's case, what happened? He was considered elevated to the status of an incarnation of God. There are 3 great interpretations of Shankaracharya's personality and his mystical teachings in English language. One by Swami Vivekananda, another by Dr. Radhakrishnan in his 2nd volume of Indian philosophy, where he expounds Shankaracharya's philosophy. And the 3rd one, which I am going to refer to now, is by Sister Nivedita, Miss Margaret Noble, who was born in Ireland of Scottish descent, and he's one of the greatest Western Vedantins, was a great devotee, a great thinker, and a great seeker of truth even before she met Swami Vivekananda. And she has written many wonderful books. One of those books is The Web of Indian Life, where in the most moving words that English language can use to capture the personality, the mysticism, the spiritual grandeur of Shankaracharya, where she writes, it is from The Web of Indian Life by Sister Nivedita, Miss Margaret Noble, the great disciple of Swami Vivekananda. In fact, in our Olima Memorial Day, one of the presentations will be on the life and teachings of Sister Nivedita, where she analyzes and sums up the contributions in the personality of Shankaracharya Western people can hardly imagine a personality such as that of Shankaracharya. In the course of so few years, they have nominated the founders of no less than 10 great religious orders, monastic orders, of which 6 have fully retained their prestige to the present day. She used the word 4, but actually 6 of those monastic orders are still very much active and flourishing in India. To have acquired such a mass of Sanskrit learning as to create a distinct philosophy and impress himself on the scholarly imagination of India in a preeminence that 1200 years have not sufficed to shake. To have written poems whose grandeur makes them unmistakable, even to the foreign and unlearned ear. People who wanted to meditate frequently listen to Shankaracharya's poems, not those who know Sanskrit language, those who don't know Sanskrit language. The symphony and integration of sense and sound, which makes it a unique inner musical symphony, is so helpful. So if you go to the Himalayan monasteries where there are hundreds of spiritual seekers from all over the world, mostly from Western countries, listen to Shankaracharya's songs, poems being sung by just recording before they meditate. That's why Sister Nivedita says to have written poems whose grandeur makes them unmistakable, even to the foreign and unlearned ear, and at the same time to have lived with his disciples in all the radiant joy and simple pathos of the saints. This is a greatness that we may appreciate but cannot understand. We contemplate with wonder and delight the devotion of Saint Francis of Assisi, the intellect of Abelard, the force and wisdom of Martin Luther, and the political efficiency of Ignatius Loyola, the founder of Jesuit, the order of Jesuits. But who could imagine all these united in one person? This is Sister Nivedita on Shankaracharya's life and personality. Now we'll come to the subject straight away. Now coming to Eckhart. One of the most distinct features of Eckhart's theology was that he tried to expound the transcendental by combining paradoxical expressions. I shall try to explain what this actually means. So before going to Eckhart, I shall give a sample of this practice of combining paradoxical expressions to demonstrate that the reality is beyond words. Now, suppose you want to tell somebody it cannot be explained. Well, it's okay in normal conversation. But in mystical and philosophical works, the fact that the experience is beyond expression or words or explanation is shown by saying, by explaining it, by trying to explain, it cannot be explained, by using mutually contradictory terms. To give an example, I shall give an example. In the masjid, of course, there are hundreds of examples in the Vedic literature. One of the most famous ones I am quoting, I shall try to explain in English to the best possible level. Okay. Now, na anta prajnam, na bhish prajnam, na ubhayada prajnam, na prajnana ghanam, na prajnam, na aprajnam, adrishyam, avyavakaryam, agrahyam, alakshanam, achindyam, avyapadeshyam, ekatma pratyasaram, prapanchopashamam, shantam, shivam, advaitam, chadurtham manyante, sa atma, sa vijñeyaka. This is what Eckhart calls the path of negation. So, he says the reality cannot be explained. So, what he used was a combination of two different words which are apparently mutually in contradiction. So, he says, for example, so it is called, the path of negation. So, he says, God is beyond qualities. And God is also with qualities, which means God is beyond something which has got qualities, and God is beyond something which is devoid of qualities. It means we cannot explain verbally what God is. We can only try to experience, and when we experience, then we understand that God is beyond explanation. So that's why he says, this is the path of negation. In his own language, the true purpose of human life is to like God, which is to say to realize absolute detachment. What is detachment? Detaching ourselves from anything that could be expressed in terms of convention, which is called the path of negation, which literally means that reality is beyond expression. Now, I shall try to explain this. He, for example, explains that God is present in everything. This God in creatures is not pantheism, but it's an expression of what in human terms is active contemplation. So when Eckhart taught that God is present in creatures, what he meant was that God is the essence of all creatures, which is called in Vedanta Antaryamitvam, or the fact that God is present in everything. To realize this, we need scriptures, we need books, but books are only a means to realize something which is beyond books. When do we realize this truth? When we are endowed with certain spiritual qualities. So that's why, he said, God made all things through me when I had my existence in the unfathomable ground of God. And then he says, to realize this truth, we need three important qualifications, which is called three essences. When the soul goes in search of the kingdom of God, taking Christ as the model, it has to free itself of the essence of the creature. So when you want to enter the kingdom of God, you should cease to be what you are physically and mentally, because you should try to become what you are in spirit, or you should become your true essence. That's what he says. So he says, when the soul goes in search of the kingdom of God, taking Christ as a model, it has to free itself of the essence of creature. God is present in all creatures, but our nature, our characteristics as a creature should be transcended to understand the reality of God. One discipline. The second is delivering the soul of its attachment to the essence of Christ as the eternal archetype. The masters teach that the archetype of the soul is a divine understanding. One of the great points of dispute between Eckhart and the traditional clergy was Eckhart tried to transcend the personal, the empirical, aspects of God expressed in terms of the Trinity. So he talked about one being, Godhead, from supreme reality. And when we realize that reality, then we understand God is present in all of us. So that's why he was accused of being influenced by pantheistic ideas. Pantheism means equating world with God, world with divine. So when he taught that we can realize the essence of God within our own heart, when we transcend empirical, when we acquire these characteristics, we can reach the highest experience. He was accused of questioning the mediation, the essential mediation of the clergy or Jesus Christ. But actually, he was elevating spiritual experience as something that goes beyond the ecclesiastical, the hierarchical demands and compulsions. The third essence from which the soul is to be freed is the primordial divine nature which manifests as the Father. The Master said that God, the Father, becomes conscious of the nature of his nature to the extent to which he is the origin of the eternal world and of all creatures. Eckhart did accept at one level that God is the creator of the world. The God, the creator, is only one particular view of God which should be transcended to experience the presence of God within us. And that God, in the ultimate analysis, goes beyond Trinity. These are some of the views which actually brought him into conflict with the ecclesiastical authorities. Now, something very similar you find in Advaitic tradition of Shankaracharya. In the Vegachudamani, Shankaracharya says, 4 essential qualifications are necessary for you to be a spiritual seeker. 1, we must first of all have a clear understanding of what is real, and we must hold fast to the real, and we must give up our attachment to the unreal. By the unreal, often it is in a way understood to be the world and all these things. Everything other than God is unreal. But he did not mean that the world or external practices, all these things are meaningless. What he said was that from the highest experience point of view, external practices have no relevance. Just as when you go to kindergarten, you have to learn the alphabet. But when you go beyond that, then you transcend that early stage of your education. Not that it becomes unreal, it becomes relative. So he approaches the reality from 3 perspectives. The absolute reality, which is equivalent to what Eckhart called the Godhead, the being, the reality that goes beyond our interpretation of the reality as Father in heaven, Son, or Holy Ghost, and so on. They are not unreal. So long as you believe this world is the supreme reality, then the reality of God as the creator of this world is real. But the moment you transcend that stage, and when you start experiencing the reality within ourselves, then we go to a higher level of understanding. I can give one example, something because maybe much more easy to understand. Perhaps one great German philosopher who lived in the 19th century was Johann Gottlieb Fichte. He was a great admirer of Kant and also Hegel. And I can just quote one interesting teaching from his teachings, which he actually took from the teachings of Eckhart. Fichte says, for example, the reality covers itself within a veil of the unreal. The absolute reality, the divine essence, expresses itself in the form of the unreal. What does it mean? The world is unreal in the ultimate analysis. It doesn't mean that the world is totally, absolutely non-existent. What it means is, it is only relative. According to Vedanta and also according to Eckhart, the absolute reality transcends time, space, and causation. If anything belongs to time, it is real only in the relative sense. And then it should have a cause. And it also should become a cause of its effect. So the cause-effect link is real only in the relative sense, not in the absolute sense. Behind the cause-effect link, there is the reality which is called the uncaused cause in Vedanta and also in the language of Eckhart. And it is a cause, but it doesn't have its own cause. It is the ever immortal, eternal reality. It is not created because there was no time when it did not exist. And it cannot cease to exist because there will be no time when it will not exist. So he used the word detachment. Once we understand the highest reality as devoid of what you call describability, when it cannot be described, it cannot be explained, it cannot be verbalized, then we understand realities as our own essence, which is called the path of negation. And this path of negation is very much a part of Vedantic tradition. It's called neti, naiti, not this, not this. After removing all that is relative or unreal in the absolute sense, then you reach a point when you cannot deny yourself. The negator cannot deny himself. If I go on telling that's not true, who am I who is making the statement that's not true? At least I should be real in comparison to what I try to say or assert as something as unreal. So that reality cannot be negated. So this path of negation was an important approach that you find in Eckhart. Another very unique, which I already mentioned at the very beginning, the unique contribution of Eckhart was his idea of accommodating revealed scriptures, reason, and also going beyond that, inner experience, which is essentially the essence of Advaita. Srutya, Yuktya, Swanubhutya. Vedantic tradition in Shankaracharya's philosophy you find. You listen to the scriptures, Bible in the context of Christianity, or Vedas in the context of Hindu, Vedanta. You listen to the scriptures, the teaching of scriptures. Then use your reason. Now, reasoning is not heresy. Here, reasoning is not questioning the authority of God. Reasoning is a process of internalizing, bringing the reality within our reach. So we use reasoning. But that reasoning is real reasoning, which understands its own limitation. So every true, genuine reasoning should take you beyond itself. And beyond reason, there is one's own inner experience. Accommodating the reality of mystical experience within the mainstream of theology was a unique contribution of Eckhart. Of course, we don't know to what extent he succeeded because he lived in the 13th century. And if you look at the history of the church ever since, you find it was not always inner experience. as something that goes beyond theology, beyond the conventions, was not accepted by the mainstream theology of Christianity. Here also, in Shankaracharya's case also, during his time, there were many opponents whom he had to face. But he asserted that reasoning is necessary. The reasoning should be something that should take you beyond itself. Now, another very interesting contribution of Eckhart to Christian theology, he has said that to say that God created the world yesterday or tomorrow would be foolishness, for God created the world and everything in it in the one present now. Indeed, time that is being passed for 1,000 years is as present and near to God as the time that now is, means God is beyond time. If you interpret God as a creator of the world, just as you interpret a goldsmith who produces golden ornaments, then you're attributing an essential function to God. You're defining God, you're explaining God, you're limiting God within the straitjacket of definitions. If you define God, then you're making the infinite finite. You are bringing God from the infinite to the level of the finite. That's so good. Let's find his expression in Shankaracharya's commentaries. What he says is this: anything that you explain or describe or verbalize is called Panja Shabda Pravritti, means 5 types of verbalization in Vedanta, non-dualism. 5 types of verbalization. You can explain something in relation to what it does, or to what it is related to, or what its characteristics are, or to what species it belongs, or what it does, what is its function. So, dravya, jadi, guna, karma, sambandha, etc. means 5 conditions of verbalization. Eckhart says, if you believe that God can be defined as the creator of this world, and if your whole understanding or description of God is only as a creator of this world, and this world is changing, which is finite, everyone knows, then you are bringing the indescribable to the level of something that could be described. You're trying to define something which is beyond definition. So that's why he says, the eternal now. The eternal means timelessness, the infinite. Now, I tell you something very interesting, and that is what connects Eckhart with Shankaracharya. When you listen to these high-sounding philosophical ideas, as many of us may look upon that way, we should remember he doesn't reject other paths. That's something very interesting. He fully accepts the value of scriptures, theology, biblical teachings. But what he says is, we have to go beyond it. We have to go beyond institutions. We have to internalize. We have to bring God to the level of our everyday, day-to-day experience. God is present in everything, not in a pantheistic sense, but in a very transcendental sense. God is our essence. God is omnipresent because God is immanent. So omnipresence through immanence. That's why he said God is present in our creatures. Everything. But we should transcend our limitations as creatures to realize the presence of God within us. So we have to remember his path was not rejecting other methods. Rituals are necessary. Ceremonies are necessary. But beyond that, There is a higher stage when God becomes a reality, an experience in our everyday life. And in fact, this is the essence of mysticism. When you transcend institutions, man-made institutions, taboos, rules and regulations, when it becomes a matter of real experience that guides our every thought, every deed, then God becomes a reality. That's what you are trying to expound. The language may be different. See, going to Shankaracharya, you find the disciplines, as you mentioned, holding fast what is real and going beyond, giving up what is unreal. Then total renunciation of any desire, having absolutely no desire for any kind of worldly enjoyments or heavenly enjoyments. Then perfect control, restraint, discipline of mind, senses, emotions and feelings. And finally, a strong desire for liberation. These are 4 disciplines according to Vedanta, and Eckhart, in his own language, summarizes these 4 into 3, which I already mentioned earlier. Just as the eternal now of Eckhart, Shankara insists on the instant or silence between 2 thoughts as the reality with which we have to integrate. That means when we go beyond thoughts, when we experience the highest reality, then our mind naturally goes to the transcendental. So the interval between 2 thoughts, where there is no thought, a complete silence, that's called going beyond words, beyond expressions, the indescribability of inner experience. Now, another very important area where you find striking similarities between between the great German mystic and Shankaracharya is this. That is their ethical philosophy. You find a very strong tendency, even a great interpreter like Rudolf Otto and even Fichte, Johann Gottlieb Fichte, have tried to, Fichte, it is pronounced in German maybe, have tried to imply that Vedanta, Advaita, non-dualism, doesn't give importance to ethical philosophy. The empirical duties and responsibilities and how we should we should interact with others. Now, Eckhart, of course, insists on ethical philosophy. Loving all the fundamental teachings of Jesus Christ, builds a Buddha, he builds an ethical philosophy. In Vedanta, the ethical philosophy, ethics is built upon the spiritual unity of humanity of creation. The idea of the spiritual oneness of creation is the philosophical foundation of ethical philosophy in Vedanta. In Eckhart, it is the reality of the presence of God in all creatures. In Vedanta, it is the reality of the spiritual unity of existence. So there are many places in the works of Shankaracharya where he brings out this idea. Even Swami Vivekananda, the infinite oneness of the soul is the eternal sanction of all morality, all ethics, and all good actions. Vivekananda expounds his own language, practical Vedanta. But the Shankaracharya's works, you find there's a famous verse in the commentary on the Mandukya Upanishad called Mandukya Kariga, it is said. Susiddhanta vyavasthasu dvaitino nisidadridham parasparam viruddhyante taihi ayonna viruddhyate. This is the verse. What it implies is this. Those who believe that their path alone is the right path and all other paths are wrong, they fight among themselves because they believe that every other path is wrong. we have to remember one important point, Vedanta does not believe in the doctrine of, or the theory of evil. Vedanta believes in the doctrine of ignorance. Even Eckhart, to some extent, could not liberate himself from the baggage of the doctrine of evil. So he also speaks about sin at the finite level. So, but he also admits that going beyond the finite, when you realize the presence of the divine in all creatures, then you also recognize the spiritual unity of creation. So, when you transcend the duality, when you transcend the empirical, when you reach the non-dualistic, the transcendental, then naturally you accept the spiritual oneness or unity of creation, and that realization is the essence of a kind of universal ethical philosophy. Coming to Shankaracharya, he says, for example, it is impossible for a spiritual seeker to quarrel with anyone, because Atma Ananyatva, that is the word, he understands the reality, the spiritual essence in everyone and everything is one. So how can we quarrel with ourselves? It's like you hit your head with your own hand and you are going to feel the pain. Your head will be somebody else, then only you can hit him, but you yourself. So if you transcend the relative, the dualistic, the empirical, and if you reach the idea of God as present in all creatures, when you transcend the finite, when you even transcend your definition of God as the creator of the world, when you realize God as the immanent and the omnipresent, then that realization itself becomes a solid foundation of a universal spiritual ethics, which was not acceptable to the traditional clergy, which actually brought him into trouble. So that's why Shankaracharya Suktya Yuktya Swanubhutya. Listen to the scriptures. He doesn't deny. As Shankaracharya believed in the validity of scriptures, the Vedas, Eckhart also believed in the validity of biblical scriptures. And Shankaracharya brought into prominence the validity of reasoning, because reasoning is a process of internalizing, bringing what we read about, what we talk about, within the realm of our own intellectual understanding, with the first step towards internalization, inner experience, bringing to inner experience. Once we do that, then that opens the door to mystical experience. And at the level of mystical experience, God and the world is realized to be one. Now, if you find any difference, apparent contradiction, it's all due to the culture or the values, the social anthropological values, conventions, which are different from the place where Shankaracharya taught his philosophy 500 years before Eckhart, and the conditions, the circumstances in which Eckhart teaches philosophy. For Eckhart, he was bringing something new. For Shankaracharya, he was bringing out the best of the Vedas, and after experiencing in his life, he was building a compact, elaborate philosophical system. So that's why often Shankaracharya says, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahma Ivana Parifan. Brahman is only reality. This world itself is unreal. Unreal means relative, means non-eternal. That's the idea behind. Now, elsewhere, the same scripture. In fact, Mundaka Upanishad says, Brahme Vedam Vishwamidam Varishtam. This world itself is Brahman. Another statement. This is a very interesting approach. It takes little understanding of the dialectical, polemical background of the two contrasting philosophical systems. On the one hand, the central doctrine of non-dualism or Advaita is Brahman, Atman is only reality. This world, everything else is only relative. That means unreal from the highest point of view, called mithya. That belongs to time, space and causation. This is one statement. But in the Mundaka Upanishad, in other Vedic literature, there are statements which tell you all this is Brahman itself. So how do you understand this? Here you can find the evolution, the progression from philosophy to experience. At a philosophical level, we assert Atman, the all-pervading reality, is only absolute reality. All these empirical world, all these mountains, valleys, oceans, all these are only relative at a philosophical level. But when this philosophical conviction becomes an inner experience, then what happens, this world as such is itself recognized as non-distinct from Brahman, because a liberated soul looks at the world not as a combination of names and forms. He looking at the world as the all-pervading reality. So a liberated soul looks at the world after detaching names and forms from the world. If you remove the varieties or differences based on names and forms, if you look at the world, then the world is actually the same essence. But this only at the experience level. That's why Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam is the experience. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya is philosophy. At the highest experience level, when you realize the all-pervading reality, then you don't see the world as we see the world. The world is seen to be non-distinct and non-different from the all-pervading Brahman. So that's why Eckhart said, God in creatures, but then the moment you transcend, you go beyond your understanding of God as the creator of the creatures or creation, then you find God is seen everywhere. So that is the evolution from philosophy to mysticism. Okay, I want to tell you a few more things about these two. Of course, within a very limited time, it is impossible. We have to remember when two great philosophers who had the courage to go beyond the conventions, beyond the institutions of which they were products. Very often you find the language, the vocabulary may differ depending upon the circumstances and also the theological traditions into which they are born. Both Eckhart and Shankaracharya were the products of the circumstances, the philosophical, spiritual landscape in which they were born. But they also gave a new shape to a philosophical tradition of which they were a product. That's what a mystic does. A philosopher cannot do that. A philosopher interprets. But a mystic gets a new insight into the philosophical ideas. That's why, from rituals to mythology to philosophy, and they're mostly religious traditions. Received religious traditions and death. But great men like Eckhart and Shankaracharya could evolve even beyond philosophy, and they could reach the highest mystical level. And what Shankaracharya did was, he built a huge edifice, a multi-storied structure. And then he built staircases for you to climb the steps to reach the top level. He also gave you a ladder you can use. So in Shankaracharya's life we find the most elaborate, the grossest forms of ceremonials, he says okay. Prayers and practices external, okay. But you should not stop there. That's what a mystic does. A philosopher, on the other hand, says, well, this system is right, that system is wrong. When you reach the mystical level, then they realize that if A is right, B need not necessarily be wrong. B also can be right from another perspective. But at the philosophical level, it is not possible. At the philosophical level, if A is right, then B cannot be right. You cannot have two rights. If one is right, the other should be wrong. There cannot be two firsts. But at the mystical level, what happens, it's like reaching the top of the hill. When you reach the top of the hill, when you look down, then you find so many roads that people take depending upon their preferences from different directions. So many trails. People are walking, following different trails and tracks to reach the same top of the hill. But if you are not reached the top of the hill, if you are walking through the track or the trail, you think this is the only road. But you can't see other roads. To see other roads, other trails, you should reach the top and then look down. Mystical experience is the top of the hill of spiritual life. And that's why Eckhart could teach such a universal spiritual philosophy, going beyond conventions. And that's what Shankaracharya did. So, when you reach the top level of experience, then you understand that every path can be an equally valid path for us to follow. Eckhart laid down 3 important disciplines, and Shankaracharya laid down 4 disciplines. Of his an intense desire for liberation is the most important motive. In the case of Eckhart, if one wants to enter the kingdom of heaven, then one should leave behind everything else. So anyway, I have tried, is an adventure to put together the ideas of these 2 great spiritual colossus, spiritual giants, who spoke of the same truth, but into different languages. Thank you. Namaskar. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti.